Thanks, Evelyn. I think I can speak on behalf of lots of people here to say how happy we are to have you back. The team did great in your absence, but we appreciate all that you do. We're so grateful and so delighted that you're well and back to us. So I'm going to speak just really briefly this morning about the background to an application for funding that was submitted with the Cancer Trial Ireland team a couple of months ago. It was a big grant and a lot of effort went in from the team here, which we really, really appreciate. And it's a concept which I think is going to persist across Europe and is an important one for us to be behind in Ireland, because it relates to equity of access to trials, but also to drugs and to cancer molecular diagnostics. So the background to this is a family of studies which are called the DRUP-like studies, drug repurposing studies. This initiated several years ago in the Netherlands, where a study which was a combined platform phase 2 study was developed. And the concept behind it is relatively simple, but the trial design is very complex. So essentially these trials are looking to improve access to patients with rare subtypes of common cancers or rare cancers to make sure that they can get personalised targeted therapy appropriate to their mutational profile by somatic mutational profiling. So what happens essentially in these studies, a patient with an advanced cancer of some kind, any solid tumour, and some studies include hematologic disorders as well. They have molecular profiling done. It could be a 50-gene panel, it could be a 500-gene panel, it could be, in some places, whole genome sequencing. And the results of that then determine what treatment they're allocated within several different baskets that are available on the clinical trial. All the drugs available on the trial are drugs that are approved for another indication, just not for the indication of that particular patient. So all approved drugs, the side effect profile is already well understood, but they're not reimbursed or available to a patient. So an example would be a patient with a BRAF mutant gallbladder cancer, for example, where there is approval of drugs targeting BRAF in other cancers like colorectal cancer, but not gallbladder cancer. That patient then would enter a particular subgroup of that trial looking at BRAF mutations in biliary tract cancers, for example. So you can imagine it starts off with a simple complex, but the trial design is very complicated because there becomes multiple different arms and multiple different potential treatment options across the trial. But essentially these trials have been opened across the Netherlands in particular, the Scandinavian countries, France, Portugal and the UK, all with similar endpoints and protocols. And the important part, I suppose, of these trial design is it's all about, yes, getting the right drug to the patient, but they also come with a national framework around them. And that framework is also looking at novel methods of generating data for drug reimbursement. So these trials also interact closely with the key bodies in that nationality, where they would have to discuss potential avenues of novel drug reimbursement, perhaps not waiting for a randomised trial to approve that locally for a particular indication, where perhaps the payer takes on the responsibility for covering the cost of that drug for a given patient if a benefit is shown. There are different models in different countries, but essentially it looks to create a framework around novel access to drugs and access to novel methods of drug reimbursement. And so after the initial study is published, the initial, I suppose, feasibility of how it had worked in the Netherlands, a network of these trials across Europe was developed, and they became really essentially sister trials across multiple countries, whereby they shared endpoints, shared protocols. And what that means is that they can then begin to share data across cohorts of patients, but also across borders. And then coming together, it then means that they can develop, I guess, a stronger voice, both with the EMA and both with payers, and also in negotiation with the pharmaceutical industry, and also in terms of cancer molecular diagnostics and sharing the data from that. So there's a UK study, is the Determine study, and I mentioned this one and highlight this one, which is the DRUP-like study led from Manchester in the UK, because it's open in Belfast. And Evelyn spoke about the idea of cross-border clinical trials. Well, this is open in Belfast, but of course not open in the Republic of Ireland. So it's a complicated design, just to say that it is a DRUP-like study that is linked to the Cancer Drug Fund in terms of obtaining approval and patients being able to get reimbursement for a drug that may be benefiting them. But essentially it follows the usual DRUP-like protocol that was initially started in the Netherlands and then has been evolved to more complex statistics and biostatistics in this version of the trial. So this study is open at the moment in Belfast, led by Dr. Vicky Coyle. And I met with Vicky some time ago, and we discussed, could I send patients up there, both to a phase 1 unit or for this trial? And it turns out we really can't. The cross-border access to clinical trials is really an issue for us. Now, it's an issue on the island of Ireland. It's also an issue across Europe, because the directive from the EU that covers cross-border access to healthcare actually does not cover cross-border access to clinical trials. So there is the similar problems across cross-border access to trials on a European-wide basis as we have on an all-island basis in Ireland. And the problems are actually very much the same. Financial responsibility, who pays when a patient gets sick out of their jurisdiction, issues of access, issues of legislation or a regulatory framework around it. The same problems on a European-wide basis we also see on an Irish all-island basis as well. So we had a good chat around this. We didn't see any clear options, but we had thought around potential solutions. And at the same time, we were invited to join this European collaborative group called PCM for EU. And essentially, this is a group of the PIs of all those DRUP-like studies across Europe who joined together to get about €3 million in funding from the EU to harmonise their efforts across the EU. So essentially, they were looking to create protocols and a framework for how one develops the correct molecular diagnostics platform, how one analyses the data, how one sets up the MDT, how one provides drug access on an individual basis, how one designs the trials that the data can be shared, and also some pathways towards that potential reimbursement. So this started with 15 European countries, all of whom had a trial either already started or hoping to start one. And the goal was to provide recommendations and share capacity across various different aspects of the pathway, and also to facilitate cross-border access across Europe to genomic testing and to the precision medicine aspect of the trials. There also was an effort in these work packages of this grant to facilitate implementation of the results into the national healthcare system, because of course doing a nice trial is fine, but unless it results in impactful change in terms of drug access in the national healthcare system, it doesn't have a wider impact and broader impact beyond a very select patient population. And a key part of this was also really providing education and support for all stakeholders involved in that process. So we were invited to join that, and at the same time we were invited to join the Primrose Consortium, which is also a €6 million grant from the EU, which was led by Norway. And this is a follow-on from the PCM for EU grant, essentially part of the Cancer Mission cluster of projects on diagnosis and treatment. And this then had expanded that family of DRUP-like trials to 24 partners, including ourselves and including our UK colleagues leading Determine. And essentially this was looking to look to the future. So while PCM for EU is looking to provide the basic framework for accessing these trials, for establishing them in your country, the Primrose Consortium, which is currently ongoing, is looking to build on that. So looking to develop novel and more pragmatic clinical trial designs, perhaps using synthetic controls, using artificial intelligence, to build cross-country collaboration in a very meaningful way, meaning to have pre-planned cross-data aggregation across trials and shared cohorts across different countries, and to publish on those together. And also to work together in terms of lobbying and from government side of things to implement it in routine practice, and importantly to address inequality across the EU, yes, but also across individual countries. So this involves the EMA are part of this collaboration. There's regulators, policymakers, payers, healthcare providers, of course, patient advocacy groups, very, very importantly. And this provides quite a strong voice within Europe in terms of advocating together, because it turns out when we look at individual countries across Europe, in terms of access to personalised cancer therapy, both diagnostics and drugs, the problems that we face are very, very much the same. So in terms of addressing these problems on a European-wide basis, it helps when we come together with one voice. It also helps in terms of drug access to come to the pharmaceutical industry with one voice. And so we can meet together as a consortium at ASCO, at ESMO, in terms of looking at new drugs or new arms for different trials. It helps rather than negotiating with 15 different trials if in fact the industry is negotiating with one central point, which is the idea behind this collaborative process. So I think I didn't show the map. Yeah, there we are. So you can see Ireland is joined there. And also, while it's an EU-funded programme, the UK is also part of the Primrose Consortium, importantly. So all of this got us thinking about a potential of a DRUP-like study for Ireland. And the structure of the PCM for EU and Primrose Consortium are such that they provide a framework and help for us to develop a protocol that's relevant to our national framework. So we were paired officially with the Determine UK study, and the Impress Norway DRUP-like studies for them to help us develop our own protocol in Ireland. and to look at the structures we would need to set up and the framework we need to establish to make that work, the pathway all the way through from the diagnostics aspect right through to discussing with government the reimbursement aspect of things. And so we have, with the help of Cancer Trials Ireland, developed the initial framework of a protocol. We have support of Roche Ireland to commit drug supply for 2 indications initially, and Cancer Trials Ireland, who have agreed to act as a study sponsor, which is a huge step forward for us. Of course, we don't have any money yet, although we do have a name and we have a lovely logo. So that led to the next step, is how do we get some funding for this? And so, again, going back to the discussion I had with Vicky Coyle in Belfast, when we sat together and thought about it, we thought, well, we don't really want to open competing studies on the island of Ireland. We would like to work together. And it developed, I suppose, between us a thought of an opportunity whereby we could develop a study in the Republic of Ireland, which should be a sister study to the Determine study, whereby we would open complementary arms. So, of course, in small jurisdictions, if you have only 2 million people or only 5 million people, you can't necessarily fill a cohort of a rare subtype of cancer. But if you have 7 million people, it becomes suddenly an awful lot easier. So we had an idea that we would develop the Progress study, which would be a sister study to Determine study, and we would open different arms. So if there was a patient with a mutation that was rather rare in Belfast, they could travel to Dublin or Galway or Cork for that trial, and they wouldn't have to necessarily go across to the UK. And similarly, in Dublin or in Galway or wherever you are, you could travel to Belfast for an arm of the study that wasn't open in the Republic of Ireland. So rather than have a competing studies, we would actually have harmonised studies across the island, so we would work together on that. So it's a nice idea, but then we began to think how much work has to be done to create that framework and those pathways around that. So it looks, again, to the earlier discussion around cross-border referral pathways, those would need to actually to be established because they don't exist for clinical trials, cancer clinical trials, on the island at the moment. We also would need to think about an all-island molecular diagnostics platform, expand the molecular tumour board. So again, we began to think about just the trials. It's the whole framework around it, actually, that becomes much more complex. And that led then to an application that was co-developed with several partners, Cancer Trials Ireland as lead partner, ourselves at TSJCI and Trinity, James's, with Queen's, with the University of Limerick, and with Almac Diagnostics. And we applied for funding under this Peace Plus programme. So this is essentially mostly EU funding, and it's really looking across 6 key themes to develop cross-border collaborative projects which help facilitate peace and reconciliation across the island. And under theme 4, which is that of healthy and inclusive communities, which is about 155 million in total funding, there was allocated €80 million to cross-border collaborative approaches to healthcare service delivery, and also, importantly, to cross-border healthcare interventional trials. So, after a long process and lots of engagement with Evelyn and many others, we finally pulled together an application under this for €7.2 million, which we submitted just about 50 minutes before the deadline, I would say, about 6 weeks ago. And so we divided the work into 3 key work packages. The first being establishment of a cross-border pathway for cancer clinical trials. And this became very clear this had to be done. And nothing beyond would work unless we had dedicated staff and personnel working in Belfast and in Dublin to link together and to map out that framework. When we began to think about this, it became more and more complex because it's not really just about a framework for referring a patient. There's also the financial aspect and the responsibility. Where does that lie? There's a regulatory framework around it and how to map that out. There's also the other parts that are relevant, of course, to the patient perspective. Does a patient have access to the correct support services if they travel outside their jurisdiction for cancer care? Do they have the correct supportive services they would require to have a reasonable quality of life while attending a different jurisdiction for their cancer care? So all the auxiliary services that come with things, is there correct transfer of information? How do we facilitate that properly? The more you think about it, the more complex it becomes. And so we did ask for dedicated funding for staff to map that pathway and to pilot it across the border for cancer clinical trials in general in Ireland. And that's the first and probably the most important work package of the grant. And there's also a specific part of that which looks at underserved populations, so patients who are typically not included in clinical trials for many different reasons. That's led from the University of Limerick, of a particular interest in that as well. Work package 2 was about development of an all-Ireland precision medicine platform. So this again was complicated because, of course, we want patients to have easy access to molecular diagnostics to screen them for the study. But transfer of patient samples, again, across the border is complex. The sharing of data across the border also is complex, and there is huge inequity both in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in terms of access, both in public versus private systems, but also geographic differences in terms of what's available. So this partnership was through Richard Turkington, who works with Almac Diagnostics, which is located in the border counties, of course, and provides molecular diagnostics support services for cancer clinical trials. And so we developed this platform in collaboration with Aidan Culhan, who leads the eHealth Hub for Cancer, where we would provide for patients who have no other access to comprehensive genomic profiling, access to a comprehensive genomic profiling of 500 gene panel. Through Almac Diagnostics, we would also have then more thorough bioinformatic evaluation of their results with the eHealth for Cancer, and that would then be available as a report to screen patients for inclusion to either determine or progress. So creating a framework in terms of that molecular diagnostics aspect to the trial, but also in a broader sense, facilitating that cross-border collaborative process around cancer molecular diagnostics, because the data is, of course, one of the most valuable parts of this type of collaboration. If we can't share the data and share samples cross-border, it becomes much more complex, and Almac had that framework in place, actually, since Brexit to help us with that. And then third, then, of course, is the trial, is our work package 3. So this, again, too complex really there to see, but essentially following the usual DRUP-like study protocols, where there's initially a screening consent, patients can have local genomic profiling done, they can access it through the trial. Also, there's a molecular tumour board discussion led through the CTI molecular tumour board, where we applied for additional funding also for that, and treatment arm allocation then to Progress, determine would have their own MTB, but could also be discussed at ours. And then we would have up to 2 arms in discussion around additional arms, of course, and these studies can have it determined currently of 5 arms, but they can be, of course, up to 15, 20, 25 as they grow and become more complex over time. So we decided to follow the determined protocol exactly in terms of our protocol design. I call it to Anna Shevlin, who did an unbelievable job in developing this protocol, I would say, and a huge amount of work in mapping it all out and in creating a beautiful work package for the grant. I was unbelievably impressed by the level of detail and the complexity of what she came up with. But this is what we had come up with. Again, that sort of Bayesian adaptive design to it, where there are cohorts up to 30. You pull out sub-cohorts where you see a signal in a particular subgroup of cancer. And then moving forward then to expansion study if there are positive signals seen in particular rare subtypes. So we submitted that, and we hope to hear by the end of the year. I think even if we're not successful in that grant, the work has been done in establishing, I suppose, the needs analysis in developing potential solutions and looking at the framework we need to establish to address some of these, and hopefully there are additional ways that we can pursue funding to help with that as well. And lastly, to just mention additional initiatives that we have developed in parallel. And again, this was based on discussions with our Norwegian colleagues through that Primrose Consortium pairing that we had with them. So in Norway, they've established, in parallel with their DRUP-like study, a framework for public-private partnership to drive forward precision oncology across Norway. They call it Connect Norway. And essentially, it involves setting up a framework and an arena for multiple stakeholders, public and private and academic, together to work to develop an ecosystem where one can work together collaboratively to solve problems across delivering precision oncology. And that's from molecular diagnostics, trials, and then also that regulatory and access policy part in terms of implementing into the healthcare system aspect of things. There's a legal framework part of things as well. And so we, having chatted to several people and led from CTI, we developed a proposal for, it's called the Align Consortium. We've been chatting to the head of IFA, also with Roche, with IQVIA and other stakeholders here, and really looking to see, can we establish a framework ourselves that could put a governance around public-private engagement to accelerate precision oncology in Ireland, again, modelled on that Connect pathway, but looking to identify an arena for all shareholders to come together and work across public and private partnership to address the obstacles that we identified in developing that grant, and to pilot perhaps novel solutions, and using, I suppose, the learnings we have from international colleagues, in particular our Scandinavian colleagues, where this has been modelled fairly successfully. So that's ongoing, I suppose, and hopefully hear more about that as we begin to develop that framework. So to finish, I think these DRUP-like studies, they're here to stay. Sometimes they're criticised because they're not the most innovative, there's not a lot of discovery within them, but what they really are a workhorse for getting drug access to our patients in a framework that is safe and that is legally robust. And so they are actually important, and as more and more countries are joining together, and they become a much more powerful, I think, advocacy group to begin to advocate on behalf of our patients in terms of drug access across the EU and the UK. Importantly, you retain independent sponsorship and funding, but you gain the power then of collaborative negotiation with regulatory bodies, stakeholders, and also with industry. And I suppose the key goal of this is to get the right drug to the right patient as quickly as we possibly can. And Ireland is already part of this network, and pending avenue outcome of the Peace Plus funding, perhaps also developing our own trial. But I think we're going to move forward regardless with trying to pursue some of those objectives we mentioned earlier on as best we can do in the meantime. Thanks.
Deirdre leaned into me there and went, whoa. Anyway, Maeve, thank you so much. What a joy to come back from sick leave to hear that presentation. Not just as a researcher involved in cancer trials and knowing the importance of genomic testing, but that group aligned, and I think some of the people in the room from that group, I was on my way to that diagnostic test to get results of it from the meeting we had in Kilmainham. And it was a room full of women. I remember that from Pharma, from Cancer Trials Ireland, from James's Hospital, and from others. And we were all really driven by this because cancer is genetic. All cancers are genetic in many ways. And we just don't know about them all yet. We know about some. We know about Lynch. We know about, BRCA. But we don't know all. And that's why these studies are so important for us in Cancer Trials Ireland. And when you're a patient listening to that, and I know there's many at home, my friends who are listening in, who are waiting 18 months for genetic diagnostics for their families, who are waiting, a while for their own. I was very impressed with what happens at our National Genetics Centre as a patient myself, very close to it, but I can also see there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in this country around this from a care point of view, from a research point of view. I'm so proud and exactly where we need to be. And I'm so proud of the team in Cancer Trials Ireland. Angela's smiling at me. Angela was there with Anna Shevlin and Olivia and everybody else who's part of this work to help Maeve to do what she does. Thank you.